Good afternoon, everybody. It is Coach Randy Bird, and it is our usual Monday Mojo coaching call, high noon Pacific time every single week, and we talk about all things production related coaching. So, top of the mind right now is obviously what's happening with NAR and all the things. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole about NAR and all the pieces, but I would like to have a dialogue around how do we maximize this from a professional standpoint, right? How do we have the language and the conversations with our people from a perspective of you being the professional, you raising yourself and elevating yourself above the clickbait that's coming out, right? I saw one last week saying the 6% commission is dead for agents. 500,000 agents will leave the industry, all this stuff because of this change. But really, the change is no different. We've been doing this for 20 years. And if you were in the business prior to 2000, I came in 2003, there wasn't even an MLS to negotiate through, right? So we all had to do buyer broker agreements, buyer representation agreements. And honestly, I think the industry just got a little lazy on the buyer side. It's my opinion. So now this allows us, thank you, Kenny, for that. The rates are at 7.05, a little bit unchanged, but still just hovering right around 7. They dipped down to about 6.91 and then back up to 7.1, and now they're right around 7 again. While we're talking about rates, they are still talking about this potentially 1 or maybe 2 rate adjustments this year. They would be down, be a downward pressure on rates, but we'll see. The numbers are coming in a little hotter than expected. The economy's doing better than expected. Inflation's higher than expected. So all these things are kind of going against lowering the rates at this time from the feds. They meet again in June. I think that's the next time that they're talking about lowering rates. They might meet in May, and then June is the next rate. But the bottom line is we're in a holding pattern for that, and there still are buyers that are looking for that to come up next, right? So what I want to focus on today, which I thought would be valuable, and we're going to need some participation in this one. If you've got your cameras off and you're doing other things, that's okay. But if you can participate, makes it a whole lot better, because that's what this is about. It's about the language that you're having with your buyers and your sellers, because they're two different conversations, really, right? So number one is being able to be fact-based. This is new territory for me in some regards. We've been representing luxury buyers that require buyer representation agreements, most of those for 6 months or a year as we look for properties for them. And that's commonplace in the luxury and commercial space. But in the real estate space, we got accustomed to the seller's agent negotiating with the seller and then determining how much money would be shared with the buyer's agents through compensation. The one thing that the settlement did is it decoupled this relationship between seller agent, buyer's agent, and effectively seller and seller's agents on one side of the equation, and the buyer and the buyer's representative is on the other side of the equation, buyer's agent. So now you're going to be required to negotiate with your buyer, and it could be from 0 to infinity, right? Still the same as it's always been. The big differences that I see are if you negotiate, you'll handle the buyer for only 1%, and then the listing's offering 2.5 or 3. You're limited to that 1%. It's not a renegotiation. It's a contractual obligation you have. So I see it, everything's negotiable. So of course the buyer could potentially decide to come up, but you've got to be really clear in that language. And what's not allowed is it's like not to exceed 4% or not to exceed. It has to be a specific contractual amount, right? So that's one material change that will be important. And that's why it's important to talk to your buyers in this negotiating language that, hey, my fee is 3%. Now, I hope that we get some of that paid for by the sellers. Matter of fact, we can try and get it all paid for by the sellers. But my requirement to work with you is this particular percentage rate, right? So that's a negotiation that you have to be strong in so you can have those conversations with your buyers. And it is new for buyers. Buyers aren't used to that payment. They're not used to paying you, the agent. The seller's been taking care of that through the clear cooperation policy for quite some time. The The other side of it that I want to open this dialogue to is the sellers. The sellers have been accustomed to paying 5.5, or 6% to the listing agent, and then passes through to the buyer's agent. And contractually, it had to say how much you're willing to pay them. And I remember we had a lot of teams that, they'd put in the MLS at 2.5, but they were getting 6. So they got 3.5 on their side, 2.5 to the MLS. And the way they got around that, including our big team when I was running it, was there's a checkbox on the California contracts that says, or per broker's policy. So it says you're paying this much to the buyer's agent, or check mark per broker's policy. And our policy was we could do whatever we wanted to do. We could put it on the MLS at 2 or 2.5 or 3 or whatever we decided based on our policy that we had in writing. And the buyers were really not involved in that relationship conversation, right? If it was on the MLS at 2, that was the compensation that was allowed. It could be negotiated. We did that lots when I was in production, meaning that if they had it on the MLS at 2 or 2.5, we would negotiate with the seller's agent to get it for 3 prior to that submitting that offer. It had to be prior to submitting the offer. Once you submitted the offer, you couldn't negotiate again. So really, in my world, it's really not changed that much. But for you, it may change a lot, especially if you're newer in the industry in the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years. This may be a completely new way of doing business. I think it's valuable to talk about the integral ways to have these conversations with your particular people. So any questions so far as we kind of talk about this topic today? Okay. So let's open up this for dialogue, right? On the buyer's side, what is your concerns? What are your thoughts? What are your beliefs? What are your delusions about how we're going to help the buyers in the new world, right? Let's just say this is all, by the way, it's very preliminary. It's the effectiveness of the NAR agreed to a $418 million settlement. An offer's been written. It's not been agreed on. It's still in the inspection period. It's still in the appraisal period. It's still in that position where a lot of things can change. Everything can change. Let me shut my door. UPS must be coming to the house. So when we look at it from that perspective, everything can still change in the future, right? Might be counteroffers, might be who knows what. So we have to go off just what we know right now. And right now it's slated to be put into action at the beginning of July, right? So after July, the idea that everybody will need to do this based on the new NAR settlements. But what's your thoughts around this as far as how you're having conversations with buyers and what can I do to help? Kenny.
I've got one thought on this, and I think a lot of it's going to come actually down to the seller side, the listing agent. I think the conversations the listing agents have with their clients are going to be huge, because obviously the listing agent can't just sit there at that house all day long and show that house. So that house wants to be sold. Basically the sellers are going to have to, the listing agent is going to talk to sellers about offering seller concessions straight up front, almost like it's a co-op, and be very careful with the language in the MLS showing that there is a way to cooperate with the buyer's agent.
Okay. I'm going to play devil's advocate and say, how are you going to get 500,000 listing agents to be on the same page?
You're not.
It's impossible.
If you get 250,000 of those agents to be on the same page, 250,000 of those houses are going to sell easily, and the other ones are going to sell in the market. So
the argument's true, Kenny. I'm not arguing the argument. I'm arguing the fact that that's the Wild West. Agents that, what about if the agent wants a listing? He's like, hey, it's not our problem anymore. They don't understand it, and it's up to the buyer now, right? So taking that listing at 3 or 2.5% are going to be customary. I think it could be commonplace, and it's going to be up to the buyer to negotiate that. And the seller agent may say, again, we're playing devil's advocate. Seller agent has no responsibility to the buyer. They have a responsibility to the seller. And now it's not even a shared fiduciary responsibility. It is singular. I have one responsibility. It's to you, Kenny, the seller. I have no responsibility to them whatsoever. Now, I believe a good professional agent is going to say, hey, it's still customary for the seller to give concessions to the buyer. So it's got to be two-part now, though. You've got to negotiate your agreement with the seller first. And then, okay, great. And by the way, this is the way I'd recommend it. Hey, Kenny, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we've had changes in the real estate industry. The changes can be significant. They could be trivial. The big difference is they decoupled how the buyer's agent gets paid. Okay. So you and I need to negotiate our commission first before we even talk about the buyer. It's off the table, right? So you and I, what are you willing to pay me? What do you want? I want 3%. Okay. Are you willing to do it for 2.5%? No, I'm 3% and I'm going to work hard for it. If we need to be aggressive later or something, I'm all on board to making your house sell. I want to be that guy to help you, but let's not negotiate before I even have a chance to go to work. Right. And then an objection handler to that would be, Kenny, would you agree that negotiation is going to be a really strong position for us as we especially move into this new market, this new, settlement series of how you get paid? Do you agree that the negotiation is going to be a really big part of that?
Absolutely.
Okay. Our first challenge is today. Our very first challenge is you and I, right? We're on the same team. I have a fiduciary responsibility to you and only you. But if I can't negotiate my half a commission with you today, which 500,000, it's still $2,500. It's a lot. I get it. But if I'm not able to have that dialogue with you and have a negotiating posture with you over why I'm worth that extra $2,500 before I even earn it, because I work for free until I get paid, right? How do you think I'm going to do it when we get an offer for 5, 10, 15, 20,000 off the asking price?
I appreciate the fact you're standing up for your $2,500 because that means you're going to stand up for my $10,000 later.
100%. And so again, I would say, trust me with the 3%. I'm going to work for it. I'm going to make my value shown very quickly. But it's really important because now we still got to negotiate the buyer side. We're not even done yet. But now that you've agreed to pay me 3%, we're good. Okay. So now let's talk about the buyer's side. And then I transition and separate those conversations that way. Because if not, number one, that's really not the way that the law is written and how we should be negotiating with the sellers. We shouldn't be negotiating the buyer's commission at this point. It's up to the seller. Now it's our job to professionally advise them in our market, using things that are factual in our market. It's customary that 88% of all listings are compensating the buyer in some way. And you could show that statistic, right? And you'll be able to get more of these statistics as we progress. Mr. Seller, the commission is not displayed for your house in the MLS anymore. Matter of fact, it's not allowed. So I have to be able to field those conversations. They don't go to you, they go to me. So I have to field the conversations of what your wishes are because it's not posted in the MLS anymore. It means I'm going to be getting a lot of calls and texts saying, what is the seller willing to do? I got a buyer that's ready, willing, and able, but he doesn't have enough down payment or he doesn't have enough help to pay his own commission. Right? So it could happen at that moment where we could weigh all options, or we could say, hey, we're willing to do this to offset that change that's coming, right? It hasn't changed much. We're still between 5 and 6%, which is the industry standard, right? So now with that said, would you like to offer them 3%, 2.5%, 2%, 1%, 0%? It's 100% up to you.
Well, they said I don't have to pay anything, Randy, so I don't want to pay anything.
Okay. 100% okay with that. May I explain the potential ramifications and or challenges with that we might have?
Please.
Okay. Number one, the buyer may not have enough funds to pay their buyer's agent, that typical 3 or 2.5%, whatever that number is that they negotiate. So they're going to be looking for us to help with that. Are you willing to help with that on a case by case, or is it you're just not open to that at all?
What are my options either way?
So my recommendation is that we follow suit with what the industry standard is. It may change as the future goes on, but right now it's very customary for the seller to help with that concession to the buyer. And it will be called a concession now, not commission. It's not flowing through me and then over to them anymore. It's actually bypassing me, going directly crossways to the buyer's agent. right? It's going to benefit the buyer's agent because the buyer and the buyer's agent have to have a negotiating agreement between them of how much they're willing to pay. So my suggestion is to you, and again, it's just my suggestion, is that we offer them a compensation to help offset that.
Okay, I hear you there, but what are the pitfalls should I not want to do that? Let's just say I do not want to offer anything to them, and that's their problem.
Yeah, so the pitfalls will be, number one, the buyer may have to pass up on your house because the buyer's agent's not being compensated to show your particular house. So once they call me, say, is there a commission offered? I say no. They're going to have to work it out between themselves, and they may go away and we may not know about it. So that's number one. That's a real possibility and probably likely. Number two is there's many loans that don't allow the buyers to pay the buyer's agent commission. VA is a great example. So I'm a military veteran. I'm going to lean on this emotionally a little bit for right now. But the reality is the VA buyers have no instrument allowed to them to pay the buyer's agent, period, end of story. So we'll lose all the buyers for the VA and any military member. A lot of firefighters, a lot of first responders, they're all in that type of a program that doesn't allow that. Now, FHA currently does, and that's a good portion of loans. So we'll be okay in that relationship. But as long as you understand that pool of buyers that we're going to alienate basically by not allowing them some kind of compensation or concession.
Something I'm curious about, Randy, is when this does start, is keeping an eye on some of the ones who took a hard line of no versus some of the ones who are offering concessions to see where they land on days on market. Because I think that would be a good
I
conversation.
think the MLS is definitely going to be looking at that very closely and hopefully within a month or two start giving us some statistics that we can factually use, because right now we don't have that and we won't have that. Washington removed it on January 1st, and they require a buyer representation agreement for an open house or anything. Washington, right here, Oregon border. I think Oregon's next. I think California follows suit personally. But again, lots of things still coming. We're not positive. So as we're having these conversations, you can see where your negotiating skills are going to be powerful to the seller to not only negotiate how this is going to impact them, but also that the language you've got to have with buyer's agents, because say the buyer's not willing to pay anything to the buyer's agent. That buyer's agent's not willing to work for zero, right? Unless they're friends or family or something. So now the buyer's most likely going to call Kenny, the listing agent. Now, Kenny, buyer calls you. Are you willing to work for free on the buyer's side?
I am not. I have brokerage fees, and I also have fees to pay to my transaction coordinator for compliance. There's going to be a charge there.
Whatever it happens to be, you have a negotiating opportunity with the buyer directly if they're saying I'm unrepresented, right?
Yeah,
now, you could do it. You could do it for $100. You could do it for 1%. You could do it for 3%. But if they call me as the selling agent, and that's a red flag potentially saying, okay, they're not willing to pay a buyer's agent. I'm not going to work for free with them as well. And my fiduciary responsibility is not transferred to the buyer just by this language of conversation. It used to be, right? We used to have some fiduciary responsibility to the buyers. I believe that's been separated now, which is, again, depends how you look at it, but I think it's an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity to get paid. It's an opportunity to relationship build with people so they understand your value and they sign this agreement saying that I'm guaranteed I'm going to get paid this amount, instead of being responsible only for what the seller's agent was able to negotiate on the buyer side, which they could do 1% and get their 3%. Right? So again, I think being a professional is where you're going to really elevate in this particular scenario. And I see Angela, also there's a recommendation, one big agent meeting to remind the seller one day they will be a buyer on the buyer's side. It's true, right? They will be on the other side of the coin soon, maybe as soon as they sell the house. But I've already talked to sellers. They're like, I don't care about them. If it's on the MLS and Zillow and everything, I'm happy. And that's all they want. And the MLS will accompany that, right? It's just there's no compensation to bring buyer's agents. So then the buyers will be directly calling you, which again, it depends on what your posture is. But mine is, I'm happy to represent you. My representation agreement is 3% for buyers, or 2.5%, or whatever you want to say it is. right? So I think the clarity of conversation is really, really important here. I think the transparency of this, of what it's meant to be, is going to get clouded. I think you will see 0% on the MLS just because of the misunderstanding that it's not our problem anymore. I don't think the big quality, solid team building agents will be doing that. Personally, I think they'll have the skill set to have a negotiating conversation with the sellers to say nothing's changed. Forget about what the New York Times said about commissions dead. We still got to pay somebody to do it on the other side. And even if I do it on the other side, I've got to be paid to do so. Right. So I can still be a dual agent. It's just there's a line in the sand now. If the buyer's willing to pay me 2.5%, 3%, I'll represent them. My fiduciary responsibility is primarily with the seller. So you can see where that's, again, back into where we are today, right? A buyer can go to the seller's agent now and say, hey, are you willing to waive 2.5% if I come directly? Well, currently, the seller's agent has the power to do that because they have a 5.5% or 6% listing. In the future, they will not. I doubt the sellers will be negotiating 6% only on the seller side, right? So again, that decoupling is what really changed the language in the equation here. Everybody understand that so far? I want to make sure you do. All right. So let's role play this a little bit. So Caitlin, you're a seller. And I say, hey, you can not pay the buyer's agent anything. And I'm okay with that. It's just I'm guaranteed to get paid this amount from the seller side of 3%. Do you want to pay anything to the buyer's side?
Well, not if I don't have to. Are they going to give me more money for my house?
No, they're not, Caitlin. And no, you don't have to. So both decisions are yours, right? You don't have to pay them anything.
Well, I do want to get my house sold because I don't want to keep paying this mortgage too. I understand that'll cost me as well. You're the expert. What do you think?
Well, I think nothing's changed from 3 months ago is what I think. I think it's just the way we pay them is differently. It's got to be structured differently where I'm not allowed to pay them anymore through our 5 or 6% that you pay me. And then we pay them to compensate and to help, to help compensate them for their work on the other side. Okay.
Okay.
So if you're really confused about this, I say we could try this out for, we've got a 6-month listing agreement. We can give it 30 days, paying zero compensation to the other side and see if our house is priced well enough. It's in the right location. All these things are perfect to get a buyer that is willing to pay their buyer's agent their commission themselves and bring us an offer that we can accept.
So I can change my mind whenever?
You can.
Okay, so I'm not stuck with anything specifically like we would have been before when I sold my last house.
That is correct. The only thing you're really agreeing to is paying me 3% if we bring you a ready, able, and willing buyer and you close escrow.
Yes, bring me a buyer.
Okay.
And then we'll figure out the rest.
So again, I'm not bringing the buyer now, right? So I'm going to market the property to other buyers and buyers agents, but it's their responsibility to get paid on their side. But what we could do is we can see how this goes, and then we can negotiate as we go forward. Okay. All right, good. Janelle.
So after 30 days, how are you going to get the word out that you're now offering commission?
That's a good point. You're going to have to make a list of everybody that's reached out to you because it's not an MLS, right? You could put it on your website. You could put it on internal things like that. It just can't go through the instrument of the MLS. So what you could say, for instance, if I was that agent and the seller and I had that conversation, I'd say, hey, we're going at it kind of wild, wild west for the first 30 days. And after that, we're going to reevaluate and see if we need to offer a buyer's concession. But at this time, we're not offering one. I apologize. But Janelle, I also recommend you write in an offer and you're able to put that language in there because it depends on your offer. If our house is at 500,000, you make an offer for 425 and ask for 3%, that's likely not going to fly. Right? I'll present all offers to my seller. That's likely not going to fly. If you bring us a full price offer and write in a buyer's concession in there to help offset your commissions, I'm all about supplying that to my seller and let them decide.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
And then again, my strength of negotiating comes into the seller. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we're basically getting an offer within 2.5% of our list price, which historically that's good, right? They're willing to give us our 500, but they're requesting a 2.5% buyer concession. And that might be disguised a whole bunch of different ways, right? Buyer repairs, concessions, whatever you want to call it. Am I allowed to, as a buyer, ask for a repair concession of $5,000? Am I allowed to ask for that?
Sure.
100%. It's negotiable, right?
Yep.
Can I ask for a $25,000 buyer concession for just whatever I feel like I want to fix on the house?
Well,
The answer is yes. It's still the same
gotta
answer.
if you want to yes back, you might want to be specific, but yeah.
Yeah, I got, I bought a flip for my dad years ago and the roof was bad. And we asked for a $26,000, $25,000 concession for the roof. But we didn't make it where they had to write a check to the roofing company. We wanted to decide. So we said, we just want a $25,000 buyer concession to offset the cost of the roof. And we got it. And I was the buyer. So I got the house for 25, it was 250 grand. I got the house for 25 grand less, like that. We had to put a roof on it. But again, it's my prerogative as a buyer to make that kind of concession offer, right?
Yeah,
It's up to the seller to decide or not.
we
period.
just closed. Yeah, we just got a $30,000 credit. for the-
Exactly. So again, a lot of ways to skin a cat here, right? If you're telling the buyer, hey, I'm going to lower this by 20 grand, that doesn't mean that you can get that money out of escrow. So there are negotiating points that are going to be important here. Does that add a little clarity to this conversation, hopefully for everybody? Yeah, I'm seeing head nodding. That's good. Yeah, Kenny.
Are agents able to do a concession to the buyer's agent? Is that allowed in California?
Say that again. What agent?
Let's just
Is
say,
the seller allowed to do concession to the buyer's agent?
yeah, let's just say that you have your listing appointment and you go, yeah, my fee is 5%. And you get under contract. And basically, as the listing agent, you're basically doing like a modification of terms. We're doing a concession to the buyer's agent and handle that situation that way.
On the surface, I would say yes, because it's your money you've negotiated and you're allowed to negotiate whatever you want. You're allowed to pay a concession to the other side, as long as everybody's a party to it and you're not hiding it from the lender and appraiser and so on. Right. We just had a deal that had a significant buyer credit because of buy down rates and all these things that are very popular and common right now. And I'm going to say it was accidental, but the contract wasn't supplied to the appraiser. And so the appraiser didn't know we had a very significant seller concession. All they saw was that we elevated the sales price, right? So we had to supply that stuff and show that. And again, transparency is key here. As long as all parties are involved, there's a lot you can do, right? Mm-hmm. So on the surface, without giving this a lot of thought, because it's different per state, I would say the biggest challenge, Kenny, right now is the MLSs don't even know what to do. They literally are trying to rewrite what we're supposed to do to stay out of harm's way again. And I just think it's going to change a lot. I think we're going to have multiple addendums and amendments to this as we progress. The number one is the VA is getting a lot of pressure from everybody, NAR and all the big companies, of how do we get to a point to where we can have VA buyers buy, because right now they cannot. Do I see more flat fees being offered, paid out versus commission percentage? Not necessarily. I think it's still based on the industry standard of a commission based, but I think you will find buyer's agents saying, hey, I'm willing to pay you $5,000 or 10 grand. And it's a business decision. If you take it or not, it's going to be up to you. I think that's possible. Yeah, I do think that's possible. Yes, there's going to be flat fee brokerages that are willing to do it for whatever amount, 1995, whatever, right? It's never been different though. The buyers have been allowed to do that forever. The difference is in the past, it was flowing through the seller's agent to an amount on the MLS, but low fee brokerages took it and put it in the MLS saying it's $1,500 flat fee, $3,000 flat fee, whatever it is. So I think you'll see a blend of those as we progress. So it doesn't matter what the listing agent's getting anymore. That's the whole reason behind this, right? There is no more, it's going to be a document between seller and buyer for buyer's concession or buyer's agent. It's not flowing through the seller's agent anymore. So they shouldn't be involved in that compensation conversation, right? The only conversation is if you text or call them, which is the weird part, you're gonna have to do that now in every deal and say, you know, there's been a lot of funny things about putting it in the language somewhere, agent friendly and all these things. But what does that mean? That's not a negotiating point. That's just agent friendly doesn't mean 3%, right? I could put agent friendly in there in bold and then it's $500. So they're still going to have to find out what the compensation is. I believe there'll be third-party portals that take this into some kind of position where they're letting agents know what the commission is. It's hard to say how this is going to play out on that side, but the reality is it's been decoupled. All
I
right.
just see like listing agents potentially being a little bit greedier since they don't have that full amount that they have to split up front. You know,
Well,
like they can go
I-
higher.
I think weaker agents are going to benefit because they only have to negotiate one half of it now. And they could dismiss the importance of the other half, which is not good for the seller. Right. So I do think that's
Exactly.
a possibility. But again, it gets back to the professional part of this industry is where the winners are going to win. I think the greatest difficulty for agents are going to be on the buyer broker side. Clearly, the sellers, they've always been able to negotiate, always get paid on the seller side. And the buyers, it's going to change a lot of the equation because buyers aren't used to this. There has not a lot of change for the sellers, in my opinion. But on the buyer sides, everything's changed. Right? Because they're going to be saying, so you're telling me I'm on the hook for 15 grand if you don't get anything from them? I'm saying yes, but we get to have those conversations before you're on the hook. Right? I'm saying that you're willing to pay me 3% from buyer's side. I'm going to go to the seller and ask for that. If they say no, you have an option not of writing that contract. But I need to get paid up to this amount to do this work. And if they're not willing to pay it, you have to pay it. Only if we're in contract, right? You don't owe me anything we're not in contract on. Right? So I think that is the delineator here when it comes to the buyer conversations. Okay. All right. Thank you for being here today. I've got my Birdhouse team call next. A couple of you on my team stay on the call, but the rest of you, thank you for being here. We'll see you next week. Next week, I'm going to be talking about how to get now business, how to do 12 transactions in the next 12 months in a brand new area, like if you fell out of an airplane. I got a request for that, so I'm going to be doing that next week. It'll be good. So come in and we'll talk about that. But if you moved into a brand new area and some of your businesses look brand new, if you moved into a brand new area, what would you do to do 12 deals in the first 12 months? And I'm going to share with you what I used to teach on this subject. All right. All right, everybody. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.
Awesome. Thanks, Randy.
You bet.